Hi, I'm Jilly G. Welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to show you how to make my gluten-free apple crisp. And a crisp is very similar to a cobbler. It's just fruit on the bottom and then some kind of topping on top. And what makes it a crisp is gluten-free oats. And then I do have some nuts here. This recipe can be made with any fruit. It can be made with peaches or berries, really any fruit that you like, pears, whatever, or a combination of all of those fruits. If you're using a really liquidy kind of fruit, such as peaches or berries, you might want to add in, a tablespoon of flour or cornstarch to your fruit mixture to help thicken it up a little bit. But apples, they don't really need any thickener. And the interesting thing is, I've got some really old cookbooks. And some of those cookbooks have recipes for a crisp that doesn't use oats at all. It uses cornflakes or some other kind of cereal. So if you don't like oats, or maybe you can't find them or you can't have them, try cornflakes or your favorite cereal. I know they make quinoa flakes that is very similar to instant oatmeal. I think that would work in place of the oats. Or for that matter, you could just do an all-nut topping if you can't have or don't like oats. But I love oats. And of course, these are gluten-free. Other than that, this whole recipe is naturally gluten-free to begin with. And of course, I won't be using any white or brown sugar, and we'll get to that. The very first thing I need to do is preheat my oven to 375. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my apples cut up. And you can use your favorite apple. I've got some Golden Delicious apples here, and then these are Jonathan apples. My local farm stand has apples right now. And Golden Delicious are usually a little bit of a softer apple, and so are Jonathan apples. And I don't mind. It really is whatever your favorite apple is, or combination of apples. And I really prefer to use different apples. I think it really adds different texture and different flavor. And you could peel your apples if you want to, but I'm not going to. I like to leave the peels on. And one of the things when you get apples fresh from an orchard or a fruit stand is sometimes they have blemishes on them, or maybe a little wormhole or something like that. I don't mind. I just cut that spot out. And then I'm just cutting my apples into bite-sized pieces. They will cook down a little bit, but I don't want them super tiny or super big chunks of apples. Whenever I'm making a fruit pie, you really do need to have exact measurements for your crust and then your filling to make sure that you fill up the pie crust, and it's a little more involved. For something like a cobbler or a crisp or even a brown Betty, which any fruit works for a cobbler, a crisp, or a brown Betty. But when you're making something like this, exact measurements really aren't necessary. But I usually aim for about 6 cups of fruit. And then I do have my other ingredients. And then the topping is usually a pretty standard recipe for the topping. But if you have an extra apple or something like that, it doesn't really matter. And you'll notice my apples are all different sizes. So I aim for about 8 apples. Depending on the size, if they're really tiny like this apple, then you might want to do, maybe 10 apples. Just use your judgment to get about 6 cups of chopped apples. And a recipe like this also works really well with frozen fruit. If you have a whole bunch of peaches or pears or apples or even berries that you have frozen from when they were in season and you didn't use them all, just take them out, make sure to thaw them and drain them really well. One of the other things I love about this recipe is this recipe is so easily made on a campfire. Maybe I should do some videos on Dutch oven cooking. But this recipe, it really is. You could make this anywhere in any dish with any fruit. I shouldn't say any dish, but you really can. You could do it in a cast iron skillet. You could do it in this casserole dish. You could make this in a cake pan. Possibilities are just endless. And I think I'll probably have closer to 8 cups of fruit, which is just fine. So once you've got all of your apples cut up, I do have 1 lemon here. And you don't have to use a lemon. You could use an orange. And I think that would be delicious. Orange and cinnamon and apples are really good together. So are lemons. And I'm not even going to measure my lemon juice either. I'm just going with the juice of 1 kind of small lemon. If you have a really big lemon, maybe just use half of it. Bring over my dish. And then I'm just going to strain my juice. I don't want any seeds in there. I'm going to move this whole thing out of the way. So to our apples, I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1 tablespoon of honey. This would be 2 tablespoons of white or brown sugar. You could substitute coconut sugar, honey like I am. You could put maple syrup, whatever you like. And then it will be a little challenging to get this cinnamon mixed together, but once you start mixing the apples with that lemon juice, it will all get mixed together. And I'm not worried if my apples turn a little bit brown. They are already a little bit brown from the cinnamon. And you might have never thought you'd be able to stir in 1 tablespoon of honey, but it really does get all stirred in. So now I've got a greased casserole dish here. And really any size of casserole dish will work as long as it's big enough to fit all of your fruit and the topping. But fruit desserts like this always cook down. And then I just try to make it kind of in an even layer here. And I really like to leave the skins on my apples. Then you can see that you have different colored apples in your dessert. So now in this bowl I've got 6 tablespoons of butter, and it is at room temperature, and I've cut it into little squares. You could easily make this in a food processor or with a pastry blender. I'm just going to use my fingers today. I feel like it's the easiest and less dishes. So that was 1 cup of toasted chopped pecans. You don't have to put nuts in here, or you could put in your favorite nut. And then 1 cup of rolled oats. Gluten-free, as I mentioned, not instant quick cooking oats. You want the rolled oats. So I'm just going to mix together my oats, my pecans, and the butter. I like to toss it around a little bit to separate my chunks of butter. And once the butter chunks are kind of separated like that, I'm actually going to add in my half a teaspoon of salt. Mix that around. And then just start rubbing the butter between your thumb and your finger. It's kind of like making a different kind of a crust or other crumble toppings. And it won't blend in as much as if this was a flour. One of the other reasons I like to do this by hand instead of a food processor is I don't want to chop up my nuts any finer than this, and I also don't want to chop up my oats. I like the big chunks of oats. And if you wanted to, you could put some kind of spices in this mixture as well. You could put in some more cinnamon or allspice, ginger, whatever spices you like to go with apples. Personally, I just like the cinnamon in with the apples and then the topping to just kind of have its own flavor. And once it starts looking like this, where it is holding together, but there are still big chunks of nuts and oats, you don't want any really big chunks of butter, but you do want everything kind of sticking together. Try to get as much off of my hands as I can. Don't want to waste any of it. So I'm going to have a quick wash up. So to my topping mixture here, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of honey and 1 teaspoon of molasses. And I've already got the molasses in here with my honey. And traditionally, you would use brown sugar to make a crumble topping like this. And maybe if you don't want to use the honey and the molasses, you could substitute coconut sugar if you want to. You could substitute maple syrup, whatever your favorite sugar or sugar substitute is. And even though it looks like it will never come together, just get in there and get mixing, and it will come together. And this is what you want it to look like. It is sticking together even more, but it still will crumble apart. So once you've got that all mixed together, bring over your apples, and then I just start dumping it on in little bits here and there, and then I can fill in any spots that might not have any. And I don't mind if the fruit is peeking through. Whenever I make fruit desserts like this, I usually will put it on a cookie sheet lined with foil. You don't have to use the foil, but it just makes for easy cleanup. If you've ever made a fruit dessert or a fruit pie or something like this that has bubbled over, it makes such a mess all over everything. So now this goes in the oven, and I usually cook this for about 30 to 40 minutes. I like my apples to be just tender, but not falling apart mushy. And if during the baking time you feel like your crumble topping is getting a little bit too brown, you could just cover the top with foil. This went for about 30 minutes, and I usually test my apples with a fork. And you can see some of my topping was starting to brown quite a bit. If my apples weren't as soft as I want them to be, I would have put a piece of foil over the top of this so my topping doesn't get super dark. My apple crisp has been cooling off for about 15 minutes. I like to serve it in a bowl. You could serve it on a plate, but because I'm going to be putting vanilla ice cream on mine, I like to make sure it's all in a bowl instead of just running on a plate. Be very careful. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but there is some juice here in the bottom. And I always try and get a little bit of that to pour on top. And I know there are recipes out there for an apple crisp where you're supposed to cook your apples first, or even add in some water to help soften your apples. But I find that that's actually not necessary, and it ends up cooking your apples more than I like, at any rate. And then I've got some homemade vanilla ice cream here. And I do have a recipe here on my channel for vanilla ice cream. So I'm going to put this back in the freezer. And I like it to be warm enough that my ice cream will start to melt, but not too hot that it will just turn my ice cream into a puddle. So let's give it a bite. And homemade ice cream always melts faster than store-bought ice cream. This is so good. It is the perfect amount of cinnamon, and my crumble topping is still crunchy, and it really has just the right amount of sweet. Of course, it's a little bit sweeter because I've got ice cream on here, but even with the ice cream, my apple flavor is coming through. I love warm fruit desserts like this, especially in the fall, especially when apples are in season, although you can get apples any time of year. Let me know if you make this recipe, and let me know what kind of apples you use. I think I've got a great combination of apples, But every time I make this, I use different apples. So just use whatever apples you've got or your favorite, and it will be delicious. And you don't have to put ice cream on it. You could serve it with just whipped cream or just as is. I would eat this for breakfast. It's got all of the things that a breakfast would have. Why not? But thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any questions or comments, let me know, and I'll see you on the next one.